It all started with a simple idea: grow food, save money, survive. When I lost my accounting job, the world felt like it had collapsed around me. Bills stacked up. My savings drained faster than I'd ever imagined. And every trip to the grocery store was a painful reminder that I couldn't afford a life I once had. Then, one evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a $200 grocery receipt while eating a simple salad. One tomato alone had cost me nearly $7. $7 for something that could grow in my backyard? That's when it hit me. Why not turn my driveway into a small garden? The next day, I drove to Home Depot with my last few dollars and bought plastic planters, soil, and vegetable seedlings. My driveway, which had been an empty stretch of wasted concrete, suddenly had a purpose. Within days, I had neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs soaking up the sunlight. It wasn't just a garden. It was hope. Neighbors stopped by, some curious, some impressed. Mr. Garcia, my elderly next-door neighbor, even offered me some old tomato cages he wasn't using anymore. But not everyone was so welcoming. 2. The unexpected enemy. One morning, as I watered my growing plants, I heard the unmistakable click of a camera shutter. I turned and saw Patricia Wilson from across the street, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, snapping photos of my driveway garden. She wore her usual all-white tennis outfit, her blonde bob frozen in place even in the breeze. Beautiful day, isn't it? I said, trying to be friendly. Her smile was tight. Just documenting some concerns for the community meeting, she replied sharply before walking away. I had a bad feeling about this. That evening, an email landed in my inbox from Richard Thompson, the president of our HOA. Subject: immediate violation notice. Dear homeowner at 476 Oakwood Drive, your driveway is in violation of HOA Code 15.3. Please remove all non-aesthetic elements within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in fines. I rushed to grab my HOA handbook and flipped through the pages. Nowhere did it say anything about vegetable gardens. Code 15.3 only mentioned keeping driveways clear of long-term storage items. These weren't storage items. They were actively growing food. I replied with a polite but firm email, citing my findings. But I had no idea just how determined Patricia and Richard were to wipe my garden off the map. 3. A silent battle begins. The next morning, a note was taped to my mailbox. Gardens belong in backyards, not where everyone has to see them. Concerned neighbor. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Patricia's, the same elegant cursive she used on last year's Christmas cards. That afternoon, as I took my trash out, I saw Richard and Patricia standing at the corner, whispering. Richard gestured toward my house, shaking his head. Patricia nodded eagerly. When they noticed me watching, Patricia flashed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived in the mail. This time, the HOA claimed my agricultural activities were inconsistent with the residential character of our community and threatened me with a $100 daily fine starting next week. That night, I stayed up researching HOA laws. I wasn't going down without a fight. 4. Selective enforcement. If my garden was a problem, what about the countless violations I saw around the neighborhood? I walked around, snapping photos, holiday decorations still up in April, basketball hoops in driveways, unapproved lawn ornaments, and more. None of these had received violation notices. I drafted a response to Richard, attaching my findings and referencing local laws that allow container gardening in residential zones. Before sending it, I knocked on Mr. Garcia's door. "They're targeting you," he said with a sigh, inviting me inside. "Why?" "Patricia wants to win the Neighborhood Beautification Award next month," he said. "And guess what she sees from her front window every day? My garden. She's been complaining to anyone who will listen," he continued. "And Richard? He always sides with her. Her husband plays golf with him every Sunday." I sent my email anyway, knowing full well they wouldn't back down. But I never expected what came next. 5. Community awakens. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find my driveway in ruins. My planters had been knocked over, soil and vegetables scattered everywhere. I checked my security camera footage, and my stomach twisted. Patricia's teenage son, Tyler, and two of his friends had deliberately kicked over my garden, laughing as they destroyed everything. Mom says these need to go. Tyler sneered in the video before stomping on my zucchini plant. Shaking, I called the police. Officer Davis arrived, watched the footage, and sighed. HOA disputes are civil matters, he said, rubbing his temples. But vandalism? That's different. He offered to file a report, but I hesitated. Escalating things might make it worse. Instead, I marched across the street and rang Patricia's doorbell. She opened the door, wearing gardening gloves, though her own yard showed no signs of actual gardening. I have video of Tyler destroying my plants, I said, voice steady. Officer Davis has seen it, too. Her face flushed, but she remained cold. Those plants are attracting pests, she snapped. The HOA has already ruled against you. Destroying property isn't the answer, I replied. Her lips curled. This neighborhood had standard before you turned your driveway into a farm. Before I could respond, she added with a smirk, check your mail. A certified letter waited for me in my mailbox. The HOA was giving me 72 hours to remove all agricultural implements or face a $100 daily fine. The next morning, I saw something alarming. Several of my neighbors standing in their driveways, holding HOA violation notices. Dave, from 3 houses down, walked over. Did you get one of these too? He asked, waving a notice about a basketball hoop. I counted 5 other neighbors with sudden violations. Bird feeders, wind chimes, flower beds. They're targeting anyone who's been friendly with me, I realized aloud. That night, I invited everyone over. To my surprise, 8 neighbors showed up, each with stories of the HOA's selective enforcement. They only enforce rules when it benefits them, said James, who had lived there for 20 years. Richard built a shed twice the allowed size, but the board made an exception. Patricia's koi pond? Same thing. We had enough. We agreed to attend the next HOA meeting together and challenge their tactics. But before that meeting could happen, the HOA made one final move that would change everything. I thought things couldn't get worse. I was wrong. The morning after our neighborhood meeting, I stepped outside to water the few surviving plants in my garden and froze. A sickly chemical smell filled the air. My tomato plants, once lush and green, were now wilting, their leaves turning an unnatural shade of yellow. The soil in my planters was damp, but not from water, from something else. Then I saw her. Patricia. She was driving by slowly, her window down just enough for me to see her smirk. She waved. I knew, right then and there, that she had done something. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and started recording. I inspected the soil, the plants. Something had been poured on them. Bleach? Pesticide? Something toxic. I clenched my fists. This wasn't a game anymore. I had tried to be reasonable. I had followed the rules. But now they were playing dirty. I took samples of the soil and recorded every detail. Then I made a call to the county agricultural office. If Patricia and Richard thought I was going to back down, they had no idea what was coming. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with everything that had happened. And then at 5:42 a.m., I heard a sound, a metallic scraping. I shot up from bed and rushed to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. 2 men in bright yellow Maple Creek maintenance vests were installing metal strips with sharp spikes along my driveway. Not just any spikes, actual tire shredders. I ran outside in my pajamas, heart pounding. Hey, stop. The older worker barely looked up. Just following HOA orders, ma'am. Orders for what? My voice shook with fury. To trap me in my own home? The younger worker shifted uncomfortably. It's, property demarcation for code violations. I pulled out my phone and started recording. They didn't even flinch. They just kept drilling spike strips into my own driveway. My hands trembled as I called the police. 20 minutes later, Officer Martinez arrived. He stepped out his patrol car, took one look at my driveway and let out a low whistle. "They did this because of the vegetable garden?" he asked, shaking his head. I nodded. "They're trying to force me to remove it." He frowned. "This is extreme. Can you make them take it out?" I asked, hopeful. His expression darkened. "Unfortunately, this is a civil dispute. The HOA does have a right to mark property boundaries." He hesitated. "Kicking at the spikes. But trapping you in? That's another story." I could see the discomfort on his face. He knew this was wrong. "I need to make some calls," he finally said. "This might be a legal overreach." Meanwhile, I had a plan of my own. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to win. I had one last hope, the county records office. That night, I borrowed my neighbor Ellie's car, since, my driveway was now a medieval trap, and drove downtown. 3 hours of searching through dusty old documents led me to something that made my hands tremble. It was a legal document from 1998, the original Maple Creek subdivision plan. And right there, in bold legal text, it stated, "Homeowners retain the explicit right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property, and this right shall not be infringed by any future HOA or governing body." My jaw dropped. I took pictures of every page. If this document held up in court, then the HOA had no legal right to stop me from gardening. And those spike strips? They weren't just unethical. They were illegal. As I left the records office, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah Jenkins, the best property rights lawyer in the county. "Meet me first thing in the morning. I think we have a case." I smiled for the first time in days. Richard and Patricia had no idea they had just walked into the biggest legal mistake of their lives. The next morning, I posted a single photo of the spike strips in our neighborhood's social media group. Caption, "Is this how HOA should handle disputes over vegetable gardens?" The post exploded. Neighbors started commenting, not just from my street, but from other neighborhoods too. By noon, a local news station had reached out. By 3 p.m., there were 3 reporters on my front lawn. The cameras rolled as I told my story. How I'd lost my job. How I tried to grow food to survive. How the HOA had vandalized my garden, fined me, targeted my neighbors, and finally trapped me in my own home. And then, right on cue, a black SUV screeched to a halt across the street. Patricia stormed out, Richard following behind. They looked like they'd swallowed lemons. "Turn those cameras off." Richard barked. The reporter didn't even blink. "Mr. Thompson, as HOA president, did you authorize the installation of these tire-shredding devices?" Patricia jumped in. "This is completely one-sided. She's been breaking the rules." The reporter turned to me. "Is there an HOA rule against container gardens?" I smiled. "No, there isn't." The camera zoomed in on Patricia's face as her argument fell apart. She grabbed Richard's arm and yanked him toward my house, whispering furiously. I already knew what was coming. They were about to offer me a deal. Richard knocked on my door later that evening. When I opened it, he didn't look so smug anymore. "Look," he said, forcing a smile, "we can resolve this quietly. Remove the garden, and we'll remove the strips. No lawyers. No media circus." I took a deep breath and pulled out a copy of the agricultural protection document. "I have a better offer," I said, handing it to him. He scanned the page. His face drained of color. This can't be real." "Oh, it's real," I said. "And tomorrow morning?" "Sarah's filing an injunction." Patricia snatched the paper from him and tore it in half. "We'll see what our lawyers say about your little farm loophole." I crossed my arms. "Go ahead, but the judge is already reviewing my case." They stormed off, but I wasn't scared anymore. The next morning, we walked into court. Over 20 neighbors showed up to support me. Richard's lawyer stood tall until the judge saw the spike strip photos. Her face hardened. "The HOA is ordered to remove these immediately." By the end of the hearing, I had won. The HOA had to pay $155,000 in damages. Richard was forced to resign, and new board elections were ordered. That evening, I stood in my driveway, watching workers rip out the spike strips. My neighbor Dave handed me a sunflower-painted planter. "For the defender of Maple Creek," he said, grinning. I smiled, looking at the vibrant new community garden we had built together. Because sometimes the biggest victories start with a single seed. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the benches behind me, whispering among themselves. I even spotted Channel 7 News setting up their cameras. At the front, Richard Thompson sat stiffly in his suit, his jaw clenched. Patricia was beside him, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white. Their lawyer, a sleek, expensive-looking man, whispered furiously in Richard's ear. But my eyes were on Judge Watkins. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I have reviewed the evidence, and I am deeply troubled by what I've seen." Richard's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," she interrupted. "I've read your brief. Now I have a question." The courtroom screen lit up with a photo of the spike strips surrounding my driveway. Gasps filled the room. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Watkins continued, "did you authorize these devices?" Richard swallowed hard. "Your Honor, they were simply property markers. They are specifically labeled as tire-puncturing deterrents," she cut in, flipping to the maintenance invoice. "Did you intend to prevent Ms. Walker from using her vehicle?" For the first time since this nightmare began, Richard was speechless. Patricia, however, wasn't. She leapt to her feet. "She was breaking the rules," she shrieked. "We gave her multiple warnings about that." Bang! Judge Watkins slammed her gavel. "Mrs. Davis, you are not recognized to speak. Sit down." The room fell dead silent. Then my lawyer, Sarah, stood. "Your Honor," she said, "not only was my client's property rights violated, but we have reason to believe the HOA engaged in harassment and unlawful detainment." She clicked a remote, and new footage played. The video showed Patricia's husband, Tom, sneaking onto my property at 2:17 a.m., slicing through my irrigation system with garden shears. More gasps. Patricia's face turned crimson. The police officer who had arrested Tom stepped forward. "Mr. Davis has already confessed," he said. He stated that his wife, Patricia Davis, told him to do something about the garden situation. Patricia sank in her seat. Her own husband had turned her in. The verdict came faster than I expected. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Watkins declared. "The HOA's actions constitute unlawful detainment, harassment, and violation of protected property rights." Patricia made a choking sound. Richard looked ready to pass out. "The HOA," the judge continued, "is ordered to remove the spike strips within the hour, pay damages totaling $155,000, reimburse all legal fees," and she turned her piercing gaze to Richard, "hold new HOA board elections within 30 days, supervised by a court-appointed observer." I couldn't believe it. "We won." Sarah squeezed my arm. "This case is going to set a major precedent for homeowners everywhere," she whispered. I turned to see my neighbors cheering. Even Mr. Garcia, who rarely left his house, was grinning. Patricia and Richard stormed out of the courtroom before the final paperwork was even signed. But the fight was over, and we had won. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of drills and hammers. I rushed outside to see a maintenance crew removing the spike strips. Officer Martinez was watching, arms crossed, making sure it was actually happening. Then I saw Dave, my neighbor, walking up with a sunflower-painted planter. "For our neighborhood's defender," he said, grinning. I laughed, running a hand over the smooth ceramic. Behind him, neighbors were gathering in my yard. Ellie, James, Sophia, even the Gonzalezes, people who had one-sided with Patricia, were now standing with me. Ellie smiled. "We were thinking, there's a lot of unused land behind the playground. What if we turned it into a community garden?" I blinked. "Wait, really? We never knew about the Agricultural Protection Clause," she admitted. "Turns out it applies to the entire subdivision, not just your house." Sophia nodded. "Patricia convinced us your garden was an eyesore. But you know what? She was wrong." I glanced at my thriving tomatoes, the green vines twisting up their stakes. The very plants that had started this war had now brought us together. Over the next few weeks, something amazing happened. Neighbors volunteered to help build a community garden. Tom, Patricia's husband, as part of his court-ordered community service, built raised beds for the new plots. Turned out he was great at carpentry. More surprising, other neighborhoods started reaching out. We heard about what happened in Maple Creek. A woman from Oak Ridge Estates told me as she admired my tomatoes. Our HOA is just as bad. How did you fight them? Soon, 3 other neighborhoods were asking for help to set up their own community gardens. And then one morning my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Guess what? The state legislature just introduced the Homeowner Food Freedom Act, and they mentioned your case by name. I stared at the message. What had started as a simple garden had changed laws. One evening, as the sun set over our newly built community garden, I stood there, watching neighbors tend to their crops. Kids ran between the rows, giggling as they watered strawberries. Sophia, who once signed Patricia's complaint, now had her own little vegetable plot. Even Patricia, though still bitter, no longer tried to fight me. She crossed the other side of the street when she saw me coming. I turned my gaze to my driveway. The spike strips were gone, but faint marks were still visible on the concrete. A reminder that standing up for what's right isn't just about winning a fight. It's about creating something better. I took a deep breath, smiling at my thriving tomato plants. Because sometimes the biggest battles start with the smallest seeds, and sometimes they grow into something much, much bigger